Hello, Candice. Welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm great, Shane. How are you?
I'm also good, thank you. We have a very interesting topic lined up for today. You know, you're a naturopathic doctor and you work in all sorts of healing fields and, you know, different modalities. And we're here today to talk about some of those things and, you know, what it means to sort of look at the body as a self-healing mechanism and how that sort of relates to disease and conditions and, you know, what all that stuff means. And beyond that, we're also going to incorporate some elements of spirituality and energy medicine to really just get a broader understanding of this field of work, which is very fascinating to me. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure to be here.
So how about we just start off with a little bit about you? What sort of got you into this field? How did you end up here?
You know, I want to say it was the turning point in my life because I was just had finished a performance review. I was working in oil and gas in Calgary, and my manager kind of said, either you get a designation or you're not getting promoted. And I thought, well, not getting promoted is not going to work for me. So I guess I better figure out what designation I'm going to get.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, at the time, I was in finance, internal audit to be specific. So I had looked at some of those, but nothing really ignited me. And I probably spent about 6 months searching all kinds of degrees, master's programs, and somehow circled back to naturopathic medicine. I remember actually being in tears when I saw the principles of naturopathic medicine, thinking to myself, I already live like this. Like, how beautiful would it be to share this with other people?
And what was it about those principles that, you know, resonated so deeply with you?
Yeah, it was treating the whole person. That was one of the elements. Whole foods diet was another principle. The activating the healing power within, which we call the beast. So activating that inner guide, like the inner system for the healing, and just all of that kind of encompassed in one place.
No, it's true. And it's quite a difference to the sort of traditional medicine that we usually see, you know, and it's not that it doesn't have its place. Of course, you know, things can work in harmony together, like surgery and all those kinds of things are pretty important as well.
Absolutely.
But it's a different approach where, you know, you go and you see a naturopath and your whole life is basically evaluated in the context of whatever ails you at that particular moment. And so it's a much more holistic, I guess is the right word to use, approach, as opposed to saying, oh, here's a list of symptoms, here's a treatment for those symptoms, right? It's very much figuring out the underlying mechanisms and what contributes to those sort of elements.
Absolutely.
But so I think, you know, an interesting place for us to start is this idea of your body as a natural healer, right?
Mm-hmm.
What does that sort of mean to you in your field?
Oh, that's a great question. So one of the things, you know, if I put the naturopathic hat on, we're taking the history of the person, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and trying to find the origin of what happened. So what was the kind of triggering event that stimulated maybe a condition or the symptoms? And what we believe in our medicine is that if we give the person the right tools, they can heal. They can their body can come back to that balance. They can come back to homeostasis and come back to their being, whatever that might be. And when I say the right tools, I'm not just saying nutrition and herbs. I'm saying nutrition and herbs and homeopathy and physical medicine. So what are the modalities that are pretty broad to help bring that person back to balance?
Right. And I suppose that's why the sort of heading of integrative medicine applies so aptly, is because it takes a very specific individual and sees what's going to work best for them, right, in that context.
Yeah. And it's you know, my personal experience has been that it really requires taking a step back to hear the story, what's said and what's not said, to help support the person on their journey.
So what do you mean, what's not said?
Oh, how do I put this into words? Sometimes, I guess one of the best examples I have is I use a modality called applied kinesiology, which is a type of muscle testing. And so often patients come in with their list of symptoms, and I'll do my muscle testing, and one of the organs I check are the lungs. And in Chinese medicine, the lungs hold grief and sadness. So if I find the lungs are out of balance for the person, my next question is, is there anything you're sad or is there anything you're grieving about? And very often that is the case. If it's not the case, I'm probably dealing with a respiratory issue with a person that they maybe don't feel in their body. So some of it's just listening to that story, because when you're meeting the person for the first time, they're not always comfortable to share all the nitty gritty. And even though we spend an hour with the person when we're meeting with them, it's a lot of time, but it's not enough time all the time to go into all that history. So some of these other things come up as we're listening.
Right. So I guess to a large degree, it's like listening to the body's communication or the signals that the body is giving that might not be sort of consciously spoken, right? Or even known about, I suppose,
Exactly.
And so do you go through a sort of systematic approach of like looking at the different organs or areas or and seeing what comes up?
So I'm going to answer that in two parts. I do and I don't. So I do from the point of view of doing a very thorough, detailed history, which can take, depends on the person, it can take quite a bit of time. Then I do physical exam, and then I do the muscle testing. And so when I'm doing the muscle testing, I sort of ignore everything I heard up until that point, which allows me to find confirmatory evidence of what the person said with their symptoms. And or I can find things that perhaps they didn't mention or didn't think was important to mention. And then we talk about that as we're going through the rest of the intake.
Right. So it's really, focused on seeing beyond just what the symptoms are, right?
Absolutely.
It's a much deeper level of connection. And the other thing that I sort of wanted to ask about, which is, earlier you and I had spoken, and one of the areas that you had mentioned that is a very crucial role is this idea of intuition, right? About how that relates both for you as the clinician, but also for the person in terms of having some sort of sense of what's going on, even if it's not exactly clear, right?
Exactly.
How does that kind of play out in this dynamic? It's a big question.
It is a big question because it comes about in different ways. Sometimes it comes about as an intuition on a question to ask. Sometimes it comes about in terms of maybe a homeopathic remedy that I'm thinking about for the person. I'm just very transparent in terms of like, why is this intuition showing up? I'm not an expert in homeopathy, but I know homeopathic medicine is very powerful when the person has the right remedy. And so that intuition comes in, am I looking at a snake remedy? Am I looking at a milk remedy? And then I go do my research and figure out which remedy in that series might be the best one for the person. And then of course I'm muscle testing to confirm that that's a remedy for the person at that time.
Right. So it's about sort of using the communicate, because, intuition itself is a complicated phenomenon. And people have lots of ideas about where it comes from, what it means, and it, and its utility, let's say, where sometimes, people argue that, well, intuition's just a subconscious sort of manifestation that's not exactly in words. And so it's still you, but it's coming up, it's in a slightly different way. And then other people argue that it's more of a divine inspiration, let's say. And so it's coming from something else, or in the sort of relational context, it could be the communication that the person is sending. Well, sending is not the right word, but the way that the other person is communicating to you beyond verbal communication. And it's sort of been well established that, verbal communication only accounts for, a relatively small percentage of all that we communicate to each other, right? And you can look at nonverbals and beyond. You can even go into the neuroscience of the sort of right brain hemisphere synchronization phenomenon. But and so it's just interesting to see how this sort of plays out in a medical context in terms of, the patient is there with you, or client, I don't know what the terminology you use is. And then, it's sort of your role to get in touch with your own intuition to figure out what's being said to you from wherever it comes from. To some degree, it's kind of secondary, right?
It absolutely is secondary. And to your point, it is very complicated and not complicated, because in order to have, my experience has been, in order to have that intuition, I have to come as a blank slate. Otherwise, I'm bringing my stuff into the room, and that's, we're humans, so I'm not gonna dismiss the fact that we all have our biases. But as much as possible, I try to come into the room with a blank slate so that I can be available for what's coming. And frankly, sometimes I'm surprised. Maybe it's an image that comes and I ask the person about it that I wasn't expecting to ask, or maybe it's a feeling. Oftentimes it's very common for people is that in our society, people like to hold everything in. They hold their emotions in, they hold their thoughts in. And then frankly, in that moment, I'm not getting a lot of information. So I might call that out. Hey, Are you the person that holds that information in? And if you're holding it in, how come? Why are we holding this information? Like, we need to, learn to let go a little bit, right? One of the most surprising images I had that came up, and I didn't know this, this is the first meeting with the person, was that there were a lot of, it was like her and all these people, almost dead people, were hanging on to her legs. And in the moment I was a bit shocked. I was like, did I get this right? Like, I don't know. Mind can make up lots of things. And so
seems kind of random. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And I said, I'm like, this might sound really off, but I just saw this image. And she's like, well, actually, I just had like 5 or 6 people that passed away in the past number of months. And I was like, okay, so let's talk about that.
Yeah. So that grief, dragging you down, or something grief, like that.
Also, in her culture, there's a mourning period, because it was a native history culture. So there's a mourning period. And so it was really important to honor that mourning period for that person. So,
it's always weird. Like, maybe weird doesn't have the right connotations to it, but it's interesting how, we sort of use imagery to convey things that are quite hard to describe or talk about, right? Even in communication, where somehow you had sort of received this, image, let's say, that seemingly came out of nowhere and understandably was quite, like, what's going on from your perspective. You're like, I don't understand this, and yet, you had the courage, or perhaps the trust in this sort of the power of this intuition to be able to say, does this mean anything to you? It doesn't mean much to me, but this is what I'm seeing or feeling or hearing or whatever it is. And it sort of presumably opened up this box that you could then explore, with her, right? So does it happen a lot, do you find?
It depends on who I'm working with. So if they're a little bit, if they're the type of person that holds a lot of stress in the body, that particular type of scenario is not happening all the time. If the person's a bit more open, then the information's more available.
That's very interesting, because this sort of phenomenon of psychic defenses, of being able to contain our emotions and feelings, while not necessarily the healthiest option in the long term, the fact that it's possible and effective is kind of interesting, right? That people can block you to these messages that they're sending, you know?
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you bring up. Yeah, super interesting. I'm just kind of contemplating it, because it's like, yeah, there is a psychic block, right? And my sense is that maybe the person's nervous, or maybe they had experiences where it wasn't safe to share.
Yeah, and for all kinds of reasons, and it's not necessarily a personal thing with you. I mean, the truth is, psychic blocks, if we're going to call it that, are often unconscious anyway. You don't even know that you're doing it, right? And that's how, there's a good literature on this sort of phenomenon of stress and emotional turmoil being repressed or shut down, or contained and not released in a way that sort of allows that energy to, well, be released. And that causes all sorts of, physiological upsets and things like that. But also, it's just interesting that we are able to, I mean, because presumably it's a defense mechanism, right?
Yes.
I think it's a good way to characterize it, of like, you don't want that feeling of vulnerability for perhaps good reason. Maybe life has taught you from when you were a kid that that's not such a good thing. Now maybe it's the right time to address that and see better ways of being in the world. But up until now, your sort of survival instincts have kicked in and being like, it's not good to be vulnerable with this stuff. So I need to set up a barrier so that, I don't have to confront anyone in that vulnerable state, even when approaching a helping professional, right? And then it's sort of up to you to untangle those bits to sort of really find out what's lying underneath. But so in terms of like how stress is stored in the body, because I think it's an important sort of point, what's your sense of that? Like, how does that kind of happen? What is it, how does that manifest for the sort of clientele that you see?
Yeah, so I would say definitely it's a protective mechanism I see that comes up, whether it's someone trying to hold in their emotions and stress because they have children, or they're a single mom, or they have a super busy life. That can be kind of a scenario that shows up. If there's past trauma, can be another reason why people hold on to stress. If they're unable or unwilling to talk about their feelings because it's uncomfortable, because they haven't had that role modeling in the past. And in terms of how it shows up, let me think. I have pretty much seen it show up in almost every system of the body. Whether it's, something that's very obvious that people can relate to is muscle tension, right? Where does someone hold their muscle tension? And a lot of times it's going to be upper back and neck. For other individuals, if it's a GI issue, then you're going to see constipation or diarrhea. It can show up that way as well. For other individuals, you might see them have kind of a chronic illness. So that gets into a whole nother thing. If there's a chronic illness or an autoimmune condition that pops up, which I also believe is a form of stress, of long-term stress that hasn't, found balance in the body. So it kind of depends on the person where that, point of weakness is, or where they're holding their stress.
But so what's kind of interesting to me now at this point is to say, okay, what is stress? I mean, I know that that's a very broad and big question, and perhaps there's not an exact answer to it because it sort of manifests itself differently in different situations. But this idea of storing stress, right, in the body, what does that kind of mean to you? What do you make of that?
So two kind of ways to look at it. From a spiritual point of view, someone's either living in the past or they're living in the future, meaning they're not living in the present moment, right? Because in the present moment, there is nothing but the present moment. So we don't have a future and we don't have a past. From the point of view of where these stressors come from, honestly, I think they happen from conception. How is the environment as the fetus is growing? And I personally, I think this is an area that is, under researched and doesn't have enough emphasis prior to conception, because there's a lot of, is the mom nervous? Are there things going on in the family that are imprinting? These are imprints because it's programming. And the reason why I talk about it is because by week 4 of the embryology, the nervous system develops. Mm-hmm. And the nervous system, right, that's where we're going to get programs for our stress. How do we handle stress? Calm environment, anxiety environment. So it's going to have 2 different outcomes. So that's part of it. And then we have the pregnancy, and then we have the birth, what happened at birth. Then we have the next 9 months. So some theory, and I'm starting to see this more often, is from conception to that 9 months sets up the stage for 75% of what the person's going to deal with the rest of their life. So it's like, oh wow. Right. So whether that programming that took place invites certain scenarios into their life, whether it's how they deal with life, do they have a calm kind of constitution or anxiety or other ones, that sort of sets the stage. And sometimes, we can go back to those, even if a person's 50 years old, and tag it back to, well, how was your mom? How was the situation? Let's look at that. So that stress piece, it's, I think to some extent it's learned. Learned. And the other aspect is, we're in 2022, and there are so many stresses we don't even see or acknowledge in our daily life that we're having to interpret, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or the news or a situation or a family, conversation. And we're like, oh, we know the cell phone is stressful, but it's like, what about all these other stresses that we don't actually integrate or, process on a daily basis?
Mm-hmm. Like our relationships with people, and, but the other part of it is that, let me take a step back. So, because I'm interested in this idea of how your sort of physiological makeup and your relationship with your mom, your primary caregiver from infancy, sort of sets the stage for your psychological and physical development, if we're going to make a distinction, which sort of tends to be done because it feels like there's a distinction, although in reality we're probably just one unit. But nevertheless, for the sake of convenience, it's a fair distinction to make. But I think it's interesting because it's like a lot of that is also, to a large degree, like how much of it can you control and how much of it is sort of subject to just the nature of the environment that exists at that time, right? And so I sort of bring it up to say, it's not necessarily fair if people hear that and say, oh, well, it's my mom's fault for messing me up in these ways. And it's like, yeah, but even if she was trying, and presumably, let's say all people try their best at any given moment, right? Yeah. And it might not have great consequences, but they're not trying to do harm usually.
No.
And so it's worth understanding your makeup so that you can make sense of things, but not in a sort of blamey kind of way.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. It's absolutely not to blame. And I brought it up because, from a holistic point of view and from a consciousness point of view, the aspect of pregnancy and that whole time period that takes place is sort of almost swept under the carpet. Yeah. Like, oh, someone's pregnant and then, they're going to take their multivitamins and the baby's born. It's like, well, wait a minute. If we really want to understand our development, and to your point about the environment, our environment does play an impact on how we were, right? Like maybe someone's adopted, for example, maybe they're born in Canada and they're adopted in Japan. And it's like, okay, well, they're going to have a different outlook and a different perspective on life than someone who's born in Canada, for example. Yeah. Just simply because they're in a different country, never mind all the other stuff that took place.
Yeah. The change in
right?
relationships and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So it's in no way am I saying it's the mother or the father's fault by any means, but it is something that, when we're looking at the whole person and spirituality and being conscious and those types of things is something to be aware of.
Yeah, and the developmental sort of process is hugely important. I agree, and it's kind of, it seems counterintuitive from the way we sort of think of things, right? Because we tend to say, well, infants and toddlers and that, well, they don't form memories, so it's not such a big deal, right?
Yeah.
Which I don't agree with. I'm just saying it makes sense to think of it that way because our sort of psychic life exists in the form of memories that we can access primarily in our sort of conscious awareness. I don't know if that's a well-phrased sentence, but I think you get what I mean. Yeah. But it's like, well, yeah, but all of that stuff sort of is grounded in a foundation, right? Exactly. And so maybe one way to look at it is it's like, well, when you're developing at those early ages, you're given a set of tools that you can use and a certain set of predispositions or temperament, or I mean, it's quite hard to really even describe properly because it's so complicated, but you sort of you learn about the world that way, right? And maybe that's the best way to think about it. Is it's babies are learning how to be in the world, and if the environment and the people that they're with teach them that the world is an unsafe place for whatever reason, then that's your sort of setup from the get-go. Is you need to assume the world is dangerous in order to maximize your chance of survival, right? Or you can have the assumption that the world is generally safe. There are dangers and things like that you need to be aware of, but generally the world is safe and people are good and things are good. And then that's your sort of foundational starting point. And so you basically are just learning. And, you can see this with babies. I mean, they spend most of their time just looking around, feeling things, tasting things, just learning, right? And it's all going in and being processed, and that's why they sleep so much. Well, that's one theory. And so it's just a learning process, even though they don't remember any of it, nor can we access those memories necessarily, but that forms the structure that then evolves into the sort of ways that we think and deal in the world, right?
Yeah. I mean, and part of it too, just to touch on, why we're not remembering is the brain for a lot of those first couple of years is in the theta, right? Like it's sort of a bit of a meditative state to some extent, right?
What do you mean theta?
So there's different brain waves that we have. I don't know all of them, but alpha, beta, theta, delta, I think are the four. And so theta is
Gamma,
one of the.
I think there's a fifth one. Yeah.
Maybe, yes.
Yeah.
So when someone's trying to be in meditation, they're not in alpha and beta because alpha and beta are more the thinking. And so the little infants, they're in that theta state. So it's very impressionable, right? If someone's doing hypnosis, it's impressionable. If someone's meditating, it's impressionable. And so that time period is impressionable.
Right.
Whether they remember it or not, but it creates, like you said, the foundation, the learning of, how do we move forward?
Yeah. And, that's why early childhood trauma is so serious, let's say, or has intense consequences, because it basically, the child learns at such an early age something that's well beyond its capacity. And, from a neuroscience perspective, I think they talk about, when there's trauma, the brain's ability to regulate sort of shatters to a large degree. And so that's very difficult to handle. And so we tend to just shut it down or repress it psychologically because you just need to live the next day anyway, right? But the consequences sort of come piling up many years later when you've survived for all this time, but that hasn't gone away. right? And so presumably trauma comes up quite a bit as well in your practice.
Yeah, it does in different forms, and I've sort of whenever I say trauma to my patients, I'm like, it can be a big T or a little T.
Yeah.
Because obviously if it's a big T, it's often not negotiable, because it's very clear it's a big T. But if it's a little T, those ones are perceived traumas by the person. So very loving environment, but for some reason the child didn't feel heard, or whatever the case was, because of their own makeup at that point, right? So it's a perceived trauma for the person. So yeah, it does come up to different extents and different situations.
That's a good distinction, actually, because I suppose trauma is typically connotated with serious things, violent trauma, sexual trauma, emotional trauma, that we would sort of all think of like, oh, you can clearly identify it, right? Yeah. But really, all sorts of little things happen that have monumental impacts on us, despite the fact that it might be a conversation that you had, or one interaction with someone that was not violent or, abusive in any way, but it had some sort of major impact on you, right?
Absolutely.
And that's why something like bullying can be so devastating.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
While not exactly a trauma, or while not necessarily a big T trauma, it can be a little T trauma, right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. And also trauma, and most people probably have some, big T and some small T traumas. Like, I don't know that anyone sort of gets around it.
No, and you know what? I worked with a psychologist at one point out of Ontario, and she said to me, which kind of really put things in perspective, she said, you could have had the perfect childhood and still be sitting in my office.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, right, and then that's where I sort of reflected on it for a while. I thought, yeah, it's a perspective, right? It's a perspective of that person. They had the perfect upbringing with all their supposed needs met, and still have some psychological stuff that they're working on.
Definitely. Almost, necessarily at some degree, because once, the sort of basic physiological needs are taken care of, well, then it's all psychologically focused, right? Then you have all the time to think and sit and do those kinds of things. If your whole life is occupied by figuring out how are you going to get food or safety for today or tomorrow potentially, well, that's all you're going to be focusing on, right?
Yeah.
Obviously. And that makes sense. And a lot of people live like that, right? But for those who don't, then you enter into this weird new phase that we kind of have moved into as a society, where there's this big reflective phase of like, who am I? What do, this, like, I think it's the self-actualization. I think, who called it that? Was it Rogers or Maslow or something like that?
Maslow. Oh, yeah. One of those.
Well, Maslow had his hierarchy of needs.
Yes.
I think self-actualization was the pinnacle of that triangle. But yeah, it's fascinating. And, it's just, to some degree, thinking about it can feel disheartening, right? But
yes,
I think a different perspective on it is probably to have a realistic, optimistic approach, which, sort of ties back into what we were talking about earlier about, well, we have this natural ability to heal ourselves, right? And you just need the right tools, situations, things like that, maybe people to help us do that, right? And that's
absolutely.
And maybe a good example is this use of trauma where, perhaps not in every case, but very successfully, many people have been healed from their traumas.
Yes.
And are in some degree much more empowered and strengthened because of it happening to them, right? And so that's a sort of different way of approaching it, which I think is probably how you tend to approach it as well. Yes. I mean, you kind of have to as a clinician, right? It would be crazy if people came to you and you were like, no, sorry, you're fucked.
Yeah, I don't say that.
No. I wouldn't
But,
expect you to, but yeah.
Like where I'm sitting, to your point, when someone comes in with stuff like that, it's like, okay, do I have the tools to help them? Do I need to refer them out? Are we referring them to the right person, when they do get referred out? Because one of the things that's become kind of apparent to me, and actually sometimes even get teary-eyed over it, is when someone is working with a professional and they're not seeming to getting better, but they didn't end the relationship soon enough.
Mm-hmm. Who didn't?
The client or the patient.
Right.
Like they're hoping for results, and some period of time goes by, and there was no result of any kind. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And for someone who's in a major trauma, a big T trauma, that's devastating.
Yeah.
And for me to hear those stories, it's heart crushing, because one of the things that I think drew me to medicine, or at least helping people, is this, like, if you're going to look at a person holistically, then it's like, why wouldn't we all work together?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't all of the practitioners work together to really support this person in their healing journey?
Yeah.
Right. So just like being that comfort zone for them as they're moving along, and so sometimes in that trauma work, it's me saying to the person, you have permission to say no.
Yeah. If it's not right for you.
If it's not right for you.
Yeah.
If it's not right for you, say no, and it's okay, because there's thousands of other practitioners.
Yeah. No, and it's a heartbreaking thing, because, this person had tremendous courage to decide to take a step towards getting better, and they've offered up their soul on a plate in front of this person to be like, can you help me?
Mm-hmm.
And if we give them the benefit of the doubt, let's say they try according to their way the best that they can, but sometimes that's not right, because for whatever reason, people need different things, or we need different healers. Even in like the psychology world, it's like, not every therapist is going to work for you. Like, you got to find one that works for you, and it's no problem of either the patient or the therapist. It's just a matter of, that ability to connect at some level. Right. Exactly. And so, it's hard for everyone. And I suppose it's to a large degree the responsibility of the practitioner or the clinician to say, or to make sure that the client is getting the benefit that they can, and say, if this isn't working for you, please tell me, and we can find someone else that maybe can.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Which is not a situation anyone really wants to be in, but it's a real thing that probably happens quite a lot. Right. You don't want to be the client, because you've now sort of perhaps gone through this whole big effort that took a lot out of you, and now this person's saying, I can't help you. And the practitioner doesn't want to be in that position, because they want to help, obviously. But to be able to acknowledge that, and then take, actionable or helpful steps forwards, like, that's important, because then you might eventually find someone who is just right for you and will be able to help you. Right.
Exactly.
It's a hard dynamic for sure. And, that's why people often give up on psychotherapy, because they go to a practitioner, they'll have a couple sessions, and they're like, I don't like the whatever something. And then they'll just say, well, then it's not for me. Right. And
yes. And that's a very good point, Shane, because I've heard that from people too, in all kinds of professions, naturopathic included, psychology, whichever. It's like, oh, I tried that once and I had a bad experience, so it's not working for me. And I was like, oh, that's also
it's
heartbreaking,
sad.
because
it's
like, maybe that profession could help, but that wasn't a good fit.
Yeah. And in the worst cases, it was a shitty practitioner,
Yes.
Which does happen too, unfortunately. But nevertheless, here we are. It's sad when that happens, because it's very disheartening to be in that position. And it makes sense why someone would say that. Like, I totally get it, especially from someone who doesn't know any better, right? Like, how would you know? If you're like, oh, well, let's use a different example. Like, oh, well, surely all chiropractors do the same stuff, right?
Right.
They crack your back. They've had the same training. They know what's happening. It's not a correct assumption, but it's an easy one to make if you don't know anything. And so you go to one and they do some stuff and it doesn't work, or it hurts, or something goes not the way you like it. And you're like, well, then all chiropractors must be doing the same thing. And so why should I go see another one? Because it's just going to be the same experience.
Exactly.
And it's just not true, though.
No, it's not true.
Yeah. And no offense to chiropractors. I love chiropractors.
No, I sit in my office and explain I'm not an expert in chiropractic work, but I certainly know that there's many different ways that they can treat. So I'm sitting there, saying, okay, well, there's all these other kinds. Like, how about this option? But yes, to your point, it would be easy to make that assumption.
Yeah. But I guess, that's why conversations like this might be helpful for people. It's to some degree, even if it's not directly applicable, it kind of might give a sense of like, oh, well, maybe I should try someone else, right?
Yes.
Like I'm still dealing with whatever this problem is. Oh, maybe they'll come to you. That would be good.
That'd be great.
Yeah. But it's just some sort of, hope that can sort of be instilled at that level, right? Now, to sort of just take a different, to sort of switch topics a little bit, right? Like, I'm interested how spirituality intersects with naturopathy. Naturopathy?
Yeah, naturopathy.
Naturopathy.
Oh, I guess it depends on where you're from, because it can be anyway.
With this accent, I have free reign to pronounce things, I'm just that's how I pronounce it.
And that's perfect. How does spirituality come in? The way it comes in for me is learning to be present with my patients. Meaning, as they're talking, I'm not sitting there thinking of the next thing. I try not to sit there thinking of the next thing to say, because if I am thinking of the next thing to say, I've missed what they've said.
Yeah, you're not listening.
I'm not listening. And I miss the cues at that point. Like, do we need to go into that topic further? So that's one way it shows up for me. Another way that I found it shows up is talking to patients about turning off the mind chatter. And so I do a lot of conversation around, like, what is the ego? What does that mean? And we're not talking from a psychological, like the psychology point of view at this time, but more of like, when is your body your friend, and when is your body not your friend? When is your mind your friend, and when is your mind not your friend? Right? If someone tells me they're sitting up late at night because their mind sounds like a hamster wheel, the mind's not their friend at that point. I need them to sleep. So I sort of rely on the spirituality in terms of my own experience of practicing it, and then bringing that experience to share with my patients, to give them hope that there is freedom, to give them hope that there is something else available, that they don't have to be in their suffering.
So for you, it's really the spirituality element is really the mindfulness or the presence practicing that comes into it, which is fine, not a criticism. I think it's great. It's important, and it's obviously helpful for innumerable number of reasons. And I like that you sort of take on the role of a role model in this case, right? Because it's important, because it's like, would you go see I don't know what the right way is, but you want the person who you're going to see for help to demonstrate that level of competence or skill in something, right? You don't want to go see someone who preaches something that they don't practice, is maybe a good way to say it. And it's hugely important to be able to say, well, because that's how we work, right? Is when we see other people being able to do it, we're like, oh, well, then maybe I can do it.
Yeah.
Much more, in a much more visceral way than just hearing about it.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Like, probably one of the more difficult things I've I've done on my spiritual journey is facing some of my negative emotions. Because there was a time when, frankly, I hated humanity, which is interesting because I had started medical school at that point, and it was like, well, you want to help people, and I even thought to myself, man, you want to help people and you hate people. Like, how is this going to work? And I can tell you, having faced those dark negative emotions, it's much easier for me to sit with the patient and let them know that it's okay if it comes up. I will sit with you if it comes up, and you can get to the other side of it. This doesn't have to be your reality forever. Right.
And that sort of internal conflict is present, right?
Yes, because the thing with the negative emotions, and I'm not talking about anxiety, because people, they sort of seem to navigate their way through the anxiety. But where there's a difficulty that I see is that if they're approaching anger to rage, that's where they want to shut down. And that's where they start to hold everything in, because, you know, if I'm going to approach the rage, I might lose control.
Dangerous.
Right? And people don't want to lose control. And, you know, there's certainly ways to deal with that are very safe, you know, because you can deal with it internally. But the fear is that they're going to lose control in some way, shape, or form.
And that anger is really a defense, right?
Yes.
Which the anger, it doesn't feel like it.
Right. So the anger is a defense for fear, actually.
Yeah. Which makes sense, right? It's better to be angry in the face of real danger than it is to be afraid to some degree. Except when it happens all psychologically, it's confusing to be able to pass those two things out, right?
Yes. Yes. You have, what I have found, you have to sit for a while and actually somehow go underneath the anger to see that there's fear under it.
Yeah, which is a fun journey for all of us. You know, we're like, oh, we're just moving from one, you know, bad feeling to another. But inevitably, that's how you get to resolution.
Yes.
There's no other way around it, unfortunately.
No, there isn't. I haven't found another way. It's to, and this is where the spirituality piece comes in. Can you be present with yourself with that emotion?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because then I tie in the physics, which I just love. So in physics, they have the particle theory. So the moment they tried to observe the location of the particle, it moved. And it's like, well, that's brilliant, because the moment I observe myself, it has to change.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm not going to say it changes overnight. It's an incremental change. But the thing is, the change that takes place over, you know, a longer period, but short relative time, is amazing. That's the part I get excited about. It's like, oh yeah, just go through this and you're going to be on this amazing, you know, other side of the island that just blows your mind afterwards. Like, I know it's really crappy, but there's just other amazing stuff.
Yeah. One step at a time, right?
Exactly.
Can't run a marathon all at once.
No.
But it's true. And it's interesting because, like, you know, your example of how you had this, you know, hatred of humanity, I think that it's a pretty pervasive feeling that people have. And I also understand that it's in context, right? It's not that you hated humanity all the time, all day, every day. It's like, no, because we have all kinds of conflicting thoughts, and some of them dominate others, and then it feels like that's the reality. But clearly it wasn't your entire reality, because you were also at medical school and had this huge desire to help people, right?
Yes.
And so for you, it was just about navigating that conflict in a sort of healthy way, right? Without just shutting it down and waiting for it to pop up again at some later point. But I think it's great that you're able to sort of normalize that for people, because I think everyone has crazy thoughts, you know?
Absolutely.
All kinds of things. I mean, you know, I doubt there'd be a person who would be willing to share every thought that they've ever had and not be a little bit worried about what other people would think. But the truth is, if we all did that, everyone would see that we're all a little bit crazy. Some maybe a little bit more, but you know, that crazy thoughts happen, and that it's okay. and that we can handle it, right?
Yes.
And that's the main point, is that you have to learn how to trust yourself to handle emotions.
Exactly.
Which is very strange that we don't, because it's such a natural part of our being, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that, because I've been sort of contemplating, like, are these are the emotions or the way that we handle things, would it be easier or different in another country?
How do you mean?
Well, I mean, I can't speak for all Canadians, but a lot of people have an upbringing, let's say English, Scottish, Irish, because we have descendants. A lot of Canadians have descendants from there.
Sure.
That very much is, you don't talk about your feelings, right?
Yeah.
I was having a conversation with someone yesterday about processing grief. Our country is terrible at processing grief. You have 2 days of bereavement and you better get back to work. And I'm like, yeah. And then the psychology text changed and says you have 6 months. It's like, wait a minute, in other countries it's 2 years of grieving. In other countries, Latin American countries, it's a Day of the Dead celebration. They're not crying, they're having a party.
Yeah.
So it's like, I was sitting there thinking, would we process emotions differently in another country, or is it more the parental kind of thing? And if we are going to process emotions differently, how do we show up to do that?
Yeah.
And I think to some extent it's the role models that we have in our life, and then after 18, it's how do we show up for ourselves?
Mm-hmm. Even before then, I would say probably. It's just less, it's not as easy, because, you're very much in your parents' house and things like that. But the culture part is you're right. And I think it's a very critical element to it. And it's probably, well, listen, people have spent their lives studying these kinds of things, and, how emotions are differ and how they are the same in different cultures. And, I think they identified sort of 6 primary emotions that are cross-cultural. What is it? Joy, anger, fear, disgust, something like that. Okay, that's
Sadness,
4.
yeah.
Sadness, yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
And what's weird about it, when you look at it, is it's like, well, the primary ones you can see cross culture, and we can actually identify them in other people's face and facial expressions, despite massive cultural differences. But what those emotions mean probably is more micro level. Although macro to a large degree as well, because if you're in a particular community or culture or country, it depends on your scale. It's like, this is just how we do things, and that's what you learn, and that's how you deal with it, but it's not necessarily good, or not necessarily bad. I mean, there's both. And it's probably the case that in all cultures, there's good things and bad things, well, good ways of dealing with it and bad ways of dealing with it, right? But it's a fascinating area to sort of think about. And, how do we sort of shape cultural or societal norms to best suit the most amount of people, or everyone, ideally, but is that really possible? It's, who knows?
Maybe another lifetime.
Yeah. Well, that's the interesting thing, is like, when there's a homogeneous culture, it's easy to regulate things widespread, but it's also easy for bad things to become equally bad widespread, right?
Sure.
And that's why evolution favors diversity, because then you have lots of options for all kinds of situations. And so diverse cultures are good in that regard as well, for sure.
Absolutely.
But yeah, it's we're strange creatures, that's for sure. It's very weird to be a human.
Yes.
It's very strange. I've often thought about how, we have this weird relationship with our emotions that doesn't make sense, because they're so natural part of our existence, and yet we have these ideas of like, oh, we should be this much emotional or that much emotional, or the men and women differ in their emotionality, and while that might be true, it's not necessarily the relevant part. Is how can each person best manage their own situation?
Yes.
right? And
Yeah.
that's hard to do. And it's not an easy task, particularly because it's not something that we're taught
Exactly.
directly. You know, what school teaches emotional affect regulation? None.
Yeah.
You know, why isn't meditation a part of school curriculum from like day one? It's a good question.
Exactly. Yeah. Agreed.
But, you know, I guess that's where like parents and things like that have to, for the moment, step up, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And we're definitely moving in that direction, I think.
Yeah.
You know, and you can see it even like how in Canada we have like 18 months of maternity leave, or what do they call it? They call it parental leave now, I believe, because it can be taken by both a mother and father separately or together, which is, you know, probably one of the highest in the world, which is amazing. And so there's all these good things that are happening, but also a long way to go.
Yes.
But anyway, listen, this has been a fantastic conversation. So thank you.
Thank you.
What would you like to, where can people find you? You know, if they want to contact you, who can contact you, from which countries? Do you do international stuff? Please promote all your things.
Yes, thank you. So people can find me on social media. So Instagram, Facebook, and sometimes I pop up on TikTok, but I won't say that's my primary one at this time.
Yeah.
One of the things I'd like to share with the audience is that I have a 6-week Energized You program where we really delve into setting up the stage in the physical realm, in terms of the body, the environment, hormones, those types of things, where you can really set the foundation for moving forward with a different lifestyle in very easy steps. In that program, there's online modules, and also I meet with people once a week to kind of answer any questions they have and talk about challenges and that thing. So if you're interested in that, please reach out. I believe there's going to be links in
absolutely
below the podcast. So we'll have the links there for you to reach out. And certainly if you want more of a direct line, you're absolutely welcome to email me, and we can set up kind of an empowerment call where we can touch base one-to-one.
Awesome. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Candice Staniek.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Awesome. I hope to speak to you again soon.
Sounds great.
Take care.